maybe we'll just wait for the Dapper Dans to finish. So I organised that so they would cue me in. Let's start talking about Disneyland. So where we're standing right now in the middle of Disneyland, in Town Square, right now is one of the most successful theme parks on Earth. It's really the first theme park on Earth. Before this, there were just amusement parks. And when Walt Disney proposed to build this park, everybody said it was going to be a failure. He consulted the Amusement Park Owners of America Association, and they all said to him, you're crazy. What you're proposing to build is nuts. You're spending too much money on making it look beautiful. You're only going to have one entrance, whereas every other amusement park in America up until that point had multiple entrances. At the time, he had an elaborate scheme of selling tickets to go on rides. They said that was too elaborate. That was not going to work. That was going to fail, and the whole thing looked like it was doomed to failure, or certainly they believed it was doomed to failure. But Walt Disney wasn't the kind of man who was put off by other people telling him he was going to fail. In fact, Walt Disney wasn't the kind of man who necessarily even recognised failure as a bad thing. In fact, Walt said that it's important for everyone to have a good hard failure earlier in their life, because from failure you build the kind of platform for success. You learn how to become successful by looking back at the things that didn't work. An excellent philosophy, I think. So it didn't start as auspiciously as we currently have it. It started off as something that was predicted to not be successful. And also when the company started building Disneyland, it wasn't in the position it is now. Disney is now probably the largest entertainment company on Earth. But back then, they had to borrow money. They had to essentially partner up with ABC Television. Walt signed a contract with ABC Television to present a TV show a year before Disneyland was about to be built, called Disneyland. The TV show was called Disneyland. And the show featured all of the different lands in Disneyland. It was themed around the different lands in Disneyland. And for the year before it was built, the whole show was essentially a promotion for Disneyland. It shaped not only the way this park was built, it shaped the modern media. I've often contended that Walt Disney is effectively the father of the modern media, because the things that he was doing, even back in the 1930s, but definitely in the 1950s, are things that we now see as standard things in media. You know, the idea of shows being sponsored by big companies. You know, the idea of building these big kind of media corporations that have lots of different arms. Walt Disney was doing that in the 1950s, at a time that nobody else was doing it. Nobody else was even thinking about it. And when they built Disneyland, as I've said, he signed a contract with ABC Television. Interestingly, at the time, they were the smallest of all of the American network stations, and Disney, at the time, were the smallest of all of the Hollywood movie studios, and they kind of needed each other. They needed the investment, the direct investment that ABC Television were going to have in Disneyland. So when it first began, ABC were stakeholders in Disneyland. They also had an input from the printing company that printed all Disney's books that were distributed at the time. The Walt Disney Company themselves obviously owned a major stake in Disneyland, but Walt Disney as an individual also sunk his own money into building Disneyland. So much so that, make no mistake, had this park not been the success it was, we would have no Disney today. It's not just that Disneyland would have closed down. The whole Disney company wouldn't exist, because everything they had was leveraged into building this park. Everything Walt Disney had personally was leveraged into building this park. He even cashed in his own life insurance to put money into building this park, because he believed in it so strongly. Walt was the kind of creative genius of the company, and his brother Roy was more like the financial muscle. I often joke that the problem you've got with me and Joy teaching you, you've kind of got Walt and Walt, we haven't got a Roy, but there you go. Roy was the financial, the wise business head, and Walt had businesses before. He had a cartoon studio called Laugh-O-Grams in Kansas City, Missouri that failed, that went bust, and he lost all his money. And it's interesting to note that only when they came together in Hollywood as the Disney Brothers cartoon studio did they start to be successful. So while obviously the company required Walt's creative genius, it also required Roy's steady hand and Roy's business acumen. A bit like Linda said yesterday about it being, you know, the whole nature of show business is there is the word business in there, and you have to kind of have that to make everything work. And Roy managed to put all the kind of financial stuff together. And I imagine Roy was constantly scratching his head, wondering what his brother was doing, because the budget for Disneyland just grew and grew and grew. It started off as an idea of a small park where they would have statues of Mickey Mouse and maybe a little train, because Walt was kind of obsessed with trains. And bit by bit, it grew into this massive thing, the like of which the world had never seen before. Now, the story of Disneyland really begins on a park bench. Remember we went to Griffith Observatory the other day? So in Griffith Park there is a carousel, and Walt used to take his two daughters, Diane and Sharon, I think on a Saturday, used to be Daddy's Day with the girls, and he used to go and sit and watch them ride the carousel. And like, if any of you have, none of you have got kids, but if you ever have kids, you will learn that actually watching kids playing in a park gets really boring really quickly. It's lovely for about 5 minutes, and then you just see them go round and round and round, and it's pretty dull. And when Walt was sitting there bored watching his kids go around on the carousel, he thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could build somewhere where the whole family could have fun together? And that was the birth of Disneyland. And if you crowd up to the rope, this, ladies and gentlemen, is that bench. This is the very bench that Walt Disney was sitting on, where reputedly he had the idea for Disneyland. I'm not a religious man, but to me this is about the closest you get to a holy relic. So I'm not going to take you in here. You can go in here later and have a look, but in here is something else that's really significant, is the Abraham Lincoln animatronic, but we'll talk about that a bit later. But it was the first human form animatronic, and it's really, really significant in the history of Disneyland.